Greetings, MMEE attendees. I regret that I'm not able to join you there in person this week, but it's great that I can give this virtual lecture on results with my colleagues probing ecological limits to evolutionary rescue. The Earth's ecosystems are under tremendous pressure from anthropogenic global change, ranging from land use change to eutrophication, overharvesting of natural populations, and of course, global warming. Together, these anthropogenic impacts are making a dire threat to the Earth's biodiversity, where a large proportion of species are predicted to be under threat of going extinct. However, species have been around for millions of years, and they've persisted through previous global changes. And so it's interesting to know, how did they manage to do it? One mechanism of persistence is dispersal, where species can change their ranges to keep up with a changing climate. But another possible mechanism of persistence is through adaptive evolution, a mechanism called evolutionary rescue. But we can't just rely on evolutionary rescue to allow species to persist. We need to probe its limits to understand when it might be effective and when it may not be. Because this topic combines both ecological and evolutionary dynamics, it's a classic of eco-evolutionary processes. So a simple model that's been very influential in this field goes back to Lynch and Landy. They looked at quadratic stabilizing selection on a single trait in an environment and subjected this trait to evolution by quantitative genetics and coupled to population dynamics. In a constant environment, there's a fitness gradient which causes species' mean trait to evolve up a hill in fitness until it reaches the peak, at which point directional selection stops and they've reached the optimum. However, in a changing environment, the fitness landscape doesn't remain static, but it changes, which they assume to change at a constant rate delta. This shifting environmental or fitness landscape leads the population to lag behind its optimum. But it's difficult to analyze because it's a non-equilibrium kind of model. The great insight of Lynch and Landy was that if you shift to a moving frame of reference, then again, we can treat this as an equilibrium problem, where instead of the landscape moving to the right at constant rate delta, now there's a fictitious force pushing the trait dynamics to the left at the same rate delta. So you see this extra term in the trait dynamics here, minus delta. I should say I'm being a little bit sloppy with notation here, where X now stands for the trait lag, not the actual trait. So for small rate of environmental change, the species gets pushed back a little. As the rate of environmental change increases, the species gets pushed back off the optimum further. And if it gets pushed back too far, then its fitness becomes negative and the species is predicted to go extinct. So to summarize the results of Lynch and Landy's 1993 model, first, we see that environmental change causes the trait to lag behind the moving optimum. This equilibrium lag increases linearly with the rate of environmental change delta. Increased genetic variance V helps the species to keep up, but there's a critical rate of environmental change where fitness equals 0, which corresponds to species extinction. This model has been the source of many further elaborations on the evolutionary side, particularly adding increased realism to the genetic incorporated. But with some colleagues, we wanted to flip the coin and look at the ecological side, which we summarized in this paper titled Ecological Limits to Evolutionary Rescue. And so we considered 4 ecological complications, starting with the shape of the fitness landscape. As I mentioned, Lynch and Landy assumed stabilizing selection given by a quadratic function. But in fact, we might expect other shapes, including a Gaussian function. So if the trait and environmental dependence of fitness enters through the birth rates can never be negative. So that provides a natural bound for this fitness landscape. And so with Matt Osmond, we incorporated this bounded Gaussian fitness function in the same framework. Now, the consequence of this Gaussian fitness function is apparent when you look at its fitness gradient, which sets the rate of directional selection. So unlike the quadratic, the Gaussian function has an inflection point beyond which the fitness gradient starts to relax again. The consequence of this shape of the fitness gradient function is that there are now two equilibria, one stable, one unstable. And so if the species were to ever lag behind further than this unstable equilibrium, they would essentially give up adapting and just go extinct. This is what we call an existential crisis. Second of all, if we increase the rate of environmental change further, there is a saddle node bifurcation beyond which the species is unable to persist at all. So this would be an unexpected catastrophic extinction that we call an evolutionary tipping point. Second, we want to include some density dependence and population regulation in this framework. Density dependence and trait dependence can each affect the birth and death rates of species. And so if we look at all four combinations, we can see in this table, the growth function looks vaguely different, yet at low density, if n were 0, these would be identical. So what are the consequences of trait dependence and density dependence entering these different demographic components of growth? On the left, we see that if they enter into different components, the results are essentially the same as we would predict from the density independent model. The equilibrium trait lag increases linearly with the rate of environmental change until we reach the critical value. If they both enter the birth rate, we get a nonlinear response, but again, we reach the same critical value. The most interesting case is where trait dependence and density dependence both affect the death rate. In this case, again, despite us using the same quadratic fitness function that Lynch and Landy used, we see again signs of these evolutionary tipping points. So this could be seen as either a good or a bad thing. On the positive side, this allows species to persist past where they would be driven extinct based on density independent analysis. But on the negative side, that extinction will be unexpected. So we see here the equilibrium population declines, but then it drops off abruptly once you reach the evolutionary tipping point. To understand the mechanism behind this evolutionary tipping point, we look at these eco-evolutionary phase planes plotting the dynamics of the trait lag versus the population size. Looking at this intermediate case, we see there are these two stable equilibria. At this equilibrium point, the population is large. Because the population is large, density-dependent death rate is large. And because trait-dependent selection happens through deaths, this increases the efficacy of natural selection, allowing the species to keep up. Whereas at this equilibrium point, corresponding to extinction, the population is small. There's not a lot of death happening because density dependence is low, and that renders adaptive evolution inefficient and prevents it from keeping up with the changing climate. Building on the last section, we know that species don't live in isolation, they have to be considered in the context of their community. So again, with Matt Osmond and now with Sally Otto, we looked at how predator-prey interactions might affect the potential for evolutionary rescue. So we consider a generalist predator, so K can be taken as the strength of predation here. And again, trait and density dependence can enter into all the terms of births, deaths due to natural causes, but also through predators in this third term. And we ask two different questions. Does the presence of the predator help prey adapt? And does it help the prey persist in changing environments? On the first question, we found that there are two distinct pathways by which predators can help prey adapt. The first is what we call selective push. This occurs when the predator's predation depends on the same trait that is undergoing directional selection in a changing environment. So if predators happen to eat more of those species that are not being selected by the environment, this pushes the prey species to track the environment more closely. The second effect is what we call the evolutionary hydra effect. This occurs when increased mortality due to predation leads to increased birth rate, where the increased birth rate helps species keep track of the environment again when trait dependence happens through births. So two different mechanisms by which predators can help prey adapt. But on the other hand, predators eat prey. That's not good for their persistence. So do these translate into increased persistence? And turns out that this question can be addressed with the simple inequality, which shows our two mechanisms. So again, if the selective push is strong enough, this allows the species to persist better with more predators, or if we have this evolutionary hydra effect. But that also requires a second assumption, which is that the fitness function's curvature needs to be positive, which is exactly what we saw in that Gaussian fitness function we studied earlier. These are the results of simulations, both equation-based and trait-based, or individual-based, by which we show that, in fact, these mechanisms work. So the gray lines represent simulations without predators, the black lines with predators. And we see that in both cases, adding the predators helps the species persist in changing environments. So this looks like a general recipe for understanding how environmental change affects species interaction in a general community context. So we can take this evolutionary quantitative genetics framework, which couples population dynamics for different species I with their trait dynamics, all driven by this fitness function G. And the simple addition of this environmental change parameter minus delta puts us in this moving frame of reference. And again, we can simply analyze the effect of environmental change on community structure. And so as an illustration of how straightforward this is, I use the classic trait-based Lotka-Volterra competition model, where species compete on a hump of carrying capacity, but they compete more strongly with species that are similar to them with a Gaussian competition kernel. And it's possible that if that competition kernel is sufficiently narrow, that multiple species can coexist through niche differentiation. So this shows the evolutionarily stable community that we reach in a constant environment. So we see that there are two species and we can barely make out, but yes, they're both at local fitness maxima. So this is a two-species evolutionarily stable state. Now we can increase the rate of environmental change, delta. What we see then is, because of this fictitious force, both species get pushed back from their pre-predation environmental change location. But it's really the species that's at the back that's suffering the most. And if we move this just a little bit further, we can see that it's the first to get pushed off the island and go extinct. Increasing the rate of environmental change further then will imperil the other species, but it manages to persist for a much larger range of parameter values. So this is summarized in these bifurcation diagrams where we look at equilibrium abundance and trait lag versus the rate of environmental change. We can see even that through the indirect effect, this blue species actually benefits from environmental change because it faces reduced competition from the gold species before it's driven extinct. So this seems like it could be a growth industry. Simply adding this environmental change parameter to any model of eco-evolutionary community assembly could generate a lot of papers. But is this, actually the best way to think about environmental change? And so for our final section, we looked at what we consider to be fundamental limits to the ecological niche. So all these models of continuous environmental change assume a fitness function, something like this one on the left, where as a function of the environment and the trait, the fitness function maintains its shape and it extends off forever. And so if we look at the regions here where fitness is positive, we can understand that starting out before environmental change, the community was here. Adding environmental change, the species begins to lag behind, but then eventually it reaches this equilibrium in the moving frame of reference, corresponding to the equilibrium trait lag. And as long as this remains inside the gray region of positive fitness, the species is predicted to persist. We suggest that a more relevant picture might be something like this, where there are fundamental limits to how well a species can adapt to a changing environment. So there are actually two limits here. There are limits to adaptive potential. There are also limits to how much the environment can actually change. So in this framework now, the gray region corresponding to persistence has this, kind of diagonal ellipsoid shape, and it presents two different critical environmental parameters. So the first is what we're calling the ecological limit. This is if a species does not evolve, what's the limit to environmental change that it can tolerate before it's driven extinct? The second limit here is this farthest point out on the ellipsoid. This corresponds to an evolutionary limit to adaptation, beyond which it's simply impossible, physically impossible for them to maintain positive fitness. So we suggest that these two limits, these absolute limits, might be sometimes more relevant than the rate-dependent limits in the Lynch and Landy framework. Now, that's not to say that rates don't matter. So if we look at simulations of a scenario where the final environment after the end of environmental change saturates is within the fundamental niche of the species, what happens depending on the rate of adaptation still matters. So in the first case, where there's sufficient adaptive capacity that they can track the changing optimum, we see that equilibrium population size doesn't suffer too much. It goes down a lot in absolute values, but they still manage to persist. But as the trajectory reaches the end of this fundamental niche, then we see that during the course of adaptation, abundances are driven lower. And if this trajectory exits the region of the fundamental niche, then the population is driven down to extremely low levels where, given demographic stochasticity, they might actually be driven extinct. So to summarize, non-quadratic fitness functions and the interplay between density dependence and trait dependence can both lead to evolutionary tipping points and existential crises. Community context matters. Predators can help prey adapt and persist sometimes, and trailing edge competitors are at heightened risk of extinction. But then, moving on, fundamental niche limits might be more important constraints to evolutionary rescue than these rate-dependent processes. So these are our conclusions. The one thing we didn't include in these models is space, which would be the alternate way the species might persist. But you can look at this top paper by John Norberg and colleagues where we included both these processes simultaneously. So I'd like to thank my co-authors on this talk, sources of funding. We did this work partially when we were on sabbatical at IDIV in Germany. And the original impetus for this paper was a symposium held at the Helmholtz Institute for Functional Marine Biodiversity. So thanks to Helmut Hillebrand for organizing that symposium. And finally, thanks to the MMEE organizers, Chauvin Lal, for putting the whole conference together, and Max and Lynn for organizing this special session. So with that, I'd like to say thanks, and hopefully I can tune in for questions today. Bye.